Hello, Victor Pross speaking to you, anarchist artist. Today we are going to be talking about the subject matter of rights. As the video is called, Stefan Molyneux and the Conception of Individual Rights, Part 1. This video series is prompted rather by videos that Stefan himself has done on the issue of rights, some past videos and more recent ones, in fact. So I'm finally getting behind the cue ball to throw my weight on the subject. And in this case, as prompted by Stefan's commentary on rights, which I am in profound disagreement with, by the way, and this is coming from a fellow anarchist. Rights do not exist, is Stefan's position. And when I first heard this commentary, I sat back in my chair thunderstruck, quite frankly. Rights do not exist. Okay, and this coming from a philosopher who's made the case for a rational-based ethics of universally preferable behavior, and who does speak of societal change, who does, in fact, speak of societal change, which I applaud him on, and which he has articulated must begin with of how children are treated and reared, but not just to that. Rights do not exist, and this coming from a philosopher who has made the case for property rights. You can't make the case for property rights if you don't recognize individual rights. One depends on the other. Now, I simply do not understand how a philosopher of Stefan's intelligence could make such a statement, most especially somebody who has studied the philosophy of Ayn Rand and general Enlightenment philosophy. Of course, I'm not suggesting, of course, that it's a cardinal sin to disagree with Rand and the Enlightenment philosophers, but Stefan's misrepresentation of rights, his complete, utter dismissal, out of hand dismissal of the subject matter at all, any conception of rights, to utterly dismiss it, is almost unforgivable. I'd say reckless and irresponsible for a philosopher who's communicating ideas and putting them out in the culture, who's speaking of anarchism, who's speaking of ethics, who's speaking of child rearing, who's speaking of philosophy, to just dismiss that subject, the subject of rights, almost unforgivable. Now, regarding Stefan's misrepresentation of rights, that they don't exist, what the fuck does that mean, that they don't exist? First of all, nobody has ever advanced the case that rights exist in the same sense that that rocks or trees or cars or tables exist. Okay, the table that I'm pounding on now, nobody's ever advanced the idea that rights exist as a tangible object. So I'm not about to speak of rights in these video series as if they were tangible objects, nor am I going to speak of rights as being inherent in our nature as human beings, in the same sense that religionists purport that physical bodies are infused with a soul. So no, rights are not some sort of inherent ghost encased in flesh. So I don't even know how the conversation has disintegrated to these Facebook bickerings over, well, what do you mean the rights don't exist? How do they exist? What do you mean by they exist? Where? I don't see no rights like I see my cell phone right now or my computer. Like, what the fuck? Rights are, as will be argued in subsequent videos, a moral principle. Get it? A moral principle, not an object. There's no need to make the issue a metaphysical jigsaw pretzel, for Christ's sakes. I don't know, perhaps the confusion rests with the word exists in the context of speaking of rights, which is very likely, but and especially becomes confounded by Stefan's categorical dismissal of the issue as a whole. That has not helped. Now, from this standard, the question, do rights exist, can also be applied to the question of morality, such as, does morality exist? Does the non-aggression principle exist? Does the scientific method exist? What the fuck does that mean? Such an approach just simply leads to an epistemological breakdown, and all intellectual discourse will go askew, like it did. What are rights? Where do they come from? One has to answer these questions. One's answers to these questions determine whether one is capable of defending a free society, to speak quite frankly. If you don't know what the fuck you're talking about on that issue, you should just really shut the fuck up. If one does not know the nature and source of rights, one cannot know whether rights are valid as a moral principle, or as an arbitrary construct, in that rights are nothing more than an emotional ejaculation. But this subject matter does not begin and end, of course, with Stefan Molyneux. He has merely just thrown his weight on the issue, taking his cue from the general philosophical wreckage that is modern culture. So let's step back and preview the issue of rights from the cultural landscape. Now, the traditional answers to the question of rights falls into three categories. Number one, here's modernity in all its ugly glory. Number one, rights are moral laws specifying what a person should be free to do, and they come from God. Number two, rights are political laws specifying what a person is free to do, and they are created by governments. Number three, rights are moral laws specifying what a person should be free to do, and they are inherent in man's nature. But each of these theories is false, and a person or society attempting to defend freedom on such grounds will ultimately fail. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you modern society. And we can see that a rational philosopher throwing in his 2 cents, his 2 cents being at least 2 of these 3 categories, does not help. So, in my video series, I want to equip you the listener, to better defend freedom on solid philosophical ground. Now, the idea that rights come from God is particularly popular among conservatives and Republicans. It certainly isn't a view that comes from Stefan, so we can exclude him on this item. But according to this theory, an all-powerful, infallible, all-good being makes moral law and gives man rights. From this premise, rights exist prior to and apart from any man-made law and cannot be granted or repealed by government. As Sarah Palin puts it, the Constitution didn't give us our rights. Our rights came from God, and they're inalienable. The Constitution created a national government to protect our God-given, unalienable rights. And James Dawson warns, if you say that rights do not come from God, and they come from the state, they can be taken away. But the theory of rights, that it comes from God, that's hopelessly irrational and intellectually insane. I know there's probably a lot of people who are listening with me. My whatever audience I have wouldn't disagree with that. To begin with, there's no evidence for the existence of such a being, much less for the existence of rights that somehow emanate from his will. Whether one believes in God is besides the point here. Either way, the fact remains that there is no evidence for God's existence, which is why it's a matter of faith, in the absence of evidence. So you can't speak of rights that come from such a being. Okay, so the idea of such a being is on very shaky ground. It's an article of faith. So the idea of rights from such a being is even on shakier grounds. And anyway, what the fuck does it mean for an all-powerful, infallible, and all-good being to give man rights? Surely if God existed and possessed such qualities, he could at any time repeal those rights and kill people at will, as he does in the stories of the Old Testament, or command or permit certain people to kill, enslave, or rape others, as he does in the scriptures of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So rights that can be revoked are not rights, but they're permissions. It's not the same thing. A permission is not a right. And now a theory of rights that permits murder, enslavement, and rape, that's not a theory of rights. That's a mockery of them, to tell you the truth. So let's throw that into the trash can. Now leftists and modern liberals are equally intellectually insane, and I do say equally insane since they are big on equality. I don't want to take that away from them. Rights, say the left, do not precede political laws, but follow from them. Rights do not precede political laws, but follow from them. Governments create laws, and the laws in turn dictate the rights and non-rights of the people who live under those governments. Absent a government, the premise dictates, there are no rights. Rights on this account are government decrees. If the government says that you have a right to take a particular action, or to be provided with a particular good or service, to speak of positive rights, so-called positive rights, then you do. And if the government says you don't, then you don't. Rights that can be granted or nullified by governments are not rights but political policies or laws, and they logically should be identified as such. To call them rights is to abuse the language. Now, the notion that government creates rights is not a viable foundation on which to advocate or defend liberty. Needless to say. And of course, I take a strong opposition to the contention that rights are an arbitrary construct fashioned by the state, which Stefan has made the case for. You can expect that from philosophical illiterates, not from a rational philosopher. It's one thing to disagree with the concept of rights as articulated by the philosophers such as Locke and Rand, but it's a very different thing to assert that they are merely constructs fashioned by hand-wringing statists and bureaucrats with nefarious designs to manipulate and control people, although most certainly they have bastardized ideas of rights and do so to this day, but that hardly puts to rest the ideas of rights as a valid moral idea categorically. To dismiss them categorically, as I said, very irresponsible. So let's clean the slate, okay? In order to understand the philosophy of individual rights, which I'll be making the case for, we have to clear the table of all previous confusions and start fresh. I believe that the case for liberty and freedom is founded upon the idea of the sovereign individual, upon the very idea of individual rights, if properly understood. And so I have taken two tasks to articulate both an explanation and defense of individual rights. So I ask you, the listener, to take heed of the arguments I'm going to present in these series, and please, by the way, subscribe and share these videos. That would be wonderful. Now, the intellectual activists in the anarchist ranks, those libertarians who spread the ideas of liberty, who are outspoken, need to understand the supreme importance of philosophy, which Stefan Molyneux himself has stressed many times in the past to his credit. It's the power of ideas that shape the world. As a philosophical anarchist, when I hear, for example, the statement to the effect that human beings have no right to exist for their own sake, but exist only to serve society or the state or the race or the planet, or when I hear a statement to the effect that reason is impotent to know reality, that our senses, our sense modalities are invalid, or that all value judgments are ultimately arbitrary, or that notions of good and evil are merely expressions of subjective emotion, I see concretely and specifically the oceans of human blood that are spilled as a consequence of such beliefs. I see Nazi Germany, I see Soviet Russia, I see the modern fucking world that we live in today is what I see with these ideas being put out there. Those type of ideas have consequences, folks. Ideas, philosophical ideas, have existential consequences in the real world. So as anarchists, we must think of the deeper issues in philosophies. We must see the forest and not just the fucking trees. As philosophical anarchists, we must understand that we are proposing an entirely different social system. We are. As philosophical anarchists, those people who communicate ideas, who are outspoken, making videos, making blogs, putting ourselves out there, making live appearances, we are proposing an entirely different social system. And a social system, since I raised the subject, is a set of moral, political, economic principles embodied in a society's laws and institutions, which determine the relationships, the terms of association among men living in a geographical area. So it's obvious that these terms and relationships depend on the identification of man's nature, to use the masculine pronoun, that they would be different if they pertain to a society of rational beings or a colony of ants. Are we going to have a society where men deal with one another as free, independent individuals on the premise that every man is an end in himself, to use the Ayn Rand phrase, or as members of a pack, each regarding others as a means to his end and to the ends of the pack as a whole? If we are going to advance a social system that advocates that men deal with one another as free, independent individuals on the premise that every man is an end in himself, is to make the case for fucking individual rights. Let me repeat that. Let me repeat that. If we are going to advance a social system that advocates that men deal with one another as free, independent individuals, observing the non-aggression principle, observing the morality, the premise that every man is an end in himself, is to make the case for individual rights. Collectivism, by contrast, means the subjugation of the individual to a group, whether to a race, a class, a state, it doesn't matter. Collectivism holds that man must be chained to a collective action and collective thought for the sake of what is called the common good. Collectivism holds that in human affairs, the collective society, the community, the nation, the proletariat, the race, the fucking planet, whatever, that's the standard of value, and the general good is what takes prominence over the good of the individual. On that view, the individual only has reality as a part of the group, and value only insofar as he serves the group. That is fucking collectivism. That is the 19th century collectivism. That is the fucking modern world that we're living in. That's the common predominant philosophy that we're fighting against. And you do not make the case against collectivism and the horrid philosophical premises that reside in people's skulls that permeates throughout fucking society by dismissing individual rights. So just to sum up this video, we have to understand that, like any work of general philosophy, these video series is not for academics, but for anybody who cares to know the fundamental ideas upon which liberty depends. The subject matter of rights is not an esoteric, trivial matter. It's foundational to a free society. It is true that the idea of rights is a very broad subject matter, but philosophy is a discipline that deals with the broadest abstractions. It's in every contest between the forest and the trees, I have taken to the forest, okay, to present my case for freedom. So I put it to you that politics is not a starting point in our thinking about man and society, but a conclusion that rests on deeper philosophical principles. So there's too many libertarians who rush into politics, almost totally ignorant of ethical philosophy, armed with nothing but a few anarchist slogans, and then they attempt to change the political machinery by the time of the next election. Is it really necessary to point out how naive and ignorant these anarchists are? Anarchists they'll repeat over and over ad nauseum, like a jungle tribal drum, the non-aggression principle. It's like an endless mantra: non-aggression, 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 non-aggression. The non-aggression principle is not an end in itself. It's a conclusion. At the foundation of a free society is the metaphysical epistemological principle that the individual survives by choosing to use his mind, and the moral principle that the good is to pursue his rational self-interest and to achieve his own happiness. The non-aggression principle makes possible such an achievement, and that's wonderful. And I will explain in these video series why the conception of individual rights is relevant to a free society. And yes, the operative word here is free society, or the operative wording here is free society. Non-aggression principle applies to the sovereign individual and how he lives his life, but individual rights speaks on a societal level. And it's nothing wrong with speaking of society. It's not a dirty word. It's not a collectivist term. It's only a collectivist term when we can consider society as some kind of like living organism that's different from, in opposition to, the individuals who comprise the concept. Okay, so it's a valid term, and it's okay to think in terms of making positive change in society. There's nothing wrong to put it that way. So as the philosopher Ayn Rand stated, the social recognition of man's rational nature, of the connection between his survival and the use of his reason, is the concept of individual rights. My friend, consider this first video an introduction to the subject matter of individual rights, and we will pick this up in part 2. I've hardly exhausted the subject. I've only scratched the surface, but thank you for listening thus far. Bye-bye now. Anarchist artist Victor Pross signing out. Pop goes the culture.